This sort of thing only happened to me once, but it left an impression on me. I'm not sure if it was an apparition or if I dreamt it. I've never told anyone the truth, as I fear I won't be believed. My father and his brother Gary were lifelong dairy farmers in central Wisconsin. We lived close by, and labor was traded during harvest. As we got older, he would send me saying, "You have to go and help at Gary's today." I grew up and took over the farm, and cousin Mike took over for his father Gary. Gary died about 15 years ago. Mike sold the dairy farm and found other employment. I rent his land. My father passed away in 2013. In 2014, I'd sold the dairy herd. It was an October night in Wisconsin. My cousin Mike started a fire in the wood-fired furnace in the basement and went to bed. His sister had just gotten out of a bad relationship and was living there too. She arrived home from her job at around midnight, added some wood to the furnace and went to bed too. Transitioning over to all the crops. In the fall of 2015, I was driving around the state looking at used equipment. What I told everyone is this. Passing through the nearest large town about 25 miles away, I decided to stop and get a meal. Seeing a movie playing that I wanted to see, I stopped to see it. Then stopped at a local bar and had a few soft drinks before returning home. Passing by his place on the way home at 3 a.m., I saw flames coming out of the chimney and smoke coming from the outside basement door. I dialed 911 and ran in yelling for them to get up. There was very little smoke in the upstairs of the house. Mike and I went downstairs and found an area about 3 feet square above the furnace on fire. We put it out with a mix of fire extinguishers and mortar, and the fire department arrived to put out the chimney fire. There was very little smoke damage to the house and minimal repairs, but a few more minutes and the fire would have burnt up into the kitchen. The truth is, I got home around 10:30 p.m. and went to bed. Sometime before 3 a.m., my father, wearing his bib overalls, something he never wore after his retirement, opened my room door, turned on the light and said, "Get up, you have to go and help out at Gary's." I remember saying, "In the morning." He then put on his most authoritative voice and said, "No, right now." I sat bolt upright in bed. My room door was open and the light in the hallway was on as well. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but I knew I had closed the door and turned off the light. Knowing, with the adrenaline rush and doubts, I would not get back to sleep, I decided to dress and check on Mike's place. That's when I saw the fire and smoke. Like I said, I never told anyone the truth as I feared no one would ever believe me. And for context, my father died in this very house. Before anything else, some context about me, because it matters for how I interpret all of this. I'm not someone who believes in ghosts. I've always leaned heavily into there's probably a logical explanation for anything camp. I'm not hostile to paranormal stories, simply never found them convincing, which is ironic considering where I grew up. I spent my entire childhood in a very old family house in rural Belgium, not far from the border. The house had been in my grandfather's family from generations and dated back to the 1600s. It looked charming from the outside, but felt unmistakably ancient when you were in. It had thick stone walls, warped wooden floors, and beams that were too low in certain rooms. Because the house had been around forever, naturally there were stories attached to it. Older villagers mentioned that they had seen someone on the property over the decades, a figure near the well, or someone glimpsed through a window. While I lived there for about 25 years, I never saw anything I'd confidently call paranormal, but there were moments that still make me uneasy when I think about it. One of the stories that always circulated in my family involved something that happened when my father was a young adult. He must have been around 19. My grandmother had gone away for a few days, and like most young guys left alone in a large house, my dad invited friends over. From how he describes it, the evening was completely normal. a handful of friends, beer and music, and among the group, one of his friends called Mark, who was energetic. During some point in the night, Mark suddenly needed to use the bathroom and rushed upstairs. Now, the staircase in that house is worth mentioning because it plays a role in everything. It was a narrow, wooden spiral staircase running almost the full height of the building, connecting the cellar all the way to the attic. The wood was dark, heavy, and worn, and Mark ran up the stairs in a hurry, and according to him, he collided with someone. Not brushed past, actually bumped into a person standing along one of the curves of the staircase. He later described it as a woman who retracted exactly the way any annoyed stranger would. She apparently let out a sharp, irritated sound, like she had been offended, and she threw up her arms in frustration, as if he'd nearly knocked her over. Mark, being moments away from disaster, barely registered any details, just said sorry and kept moving towards the bathroom. It wasn't until he'd come down and his brain caught up with what happened. Embarrassed, he went up to my father and mentioned that he might have just rudely run into his mum upstairs. My dad, confused, shifted to discomfort when very quickly he reminded Mark that she wasn't even in the country at that moment. What followed wasn't fear of ghosts, but for fear of a break-in. My dad and his friends immediately assumed there must be an intruder, and they searched every room, the cellar, the storage areas, even the attic, but found no one. I actually met Mark years later as a teenager, and what always struck me was how consistent his story remained. For what it's worth, I still suspect alcohol played a role in this, and my dad agrees as well. But it remains an oddly specific experience for something that was supposedly imagined. This next story happened when I was around 8. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to a sound that didn't belong in our house. A deep rhythmic noise, something rolling across the wooden floor. Even now, the closest comparison I could make is a massive wooded barrel studded with nails rolling in circles. The attic was directly above my bedroom, and the sound seemed to move continuously as if whatever it was kept circling the space. It went on for long enough for fear to set in, and I remember lying completely still, trying to convince myself I misheard something. Eventually, I heard my parents' bedroom door open and my father stepped into the hallway, clearly listening. My younger sibling cracked their door open too, which confirmed that it wasn't just my imagination. My father, now visibly alarmed, grabbed an old tool from downstairs, which I later learned was a hatchet, and went up the staircase into the attic. At the moment he began climbing, the sound stopped completely. When he checked the attic, he looked thoroughly and nothing was out of place. There was nothing that could have accounted for the noise. To this day, no one in my family has a satisfying explanation. We did occasionally have small animals in the roof space, so I've always leaned towards some strange combination of echoes and animal movement. But that never really matched my hypothesis. Years later, after university, I moved to the UK for further study, and ended up volunteering at a wildlife rescue centre in a coastal town in Wales. Like many older properties, it was repurposed for public use, and it had its own collection of ghost stories. Well, I lived on site for nearly a year and never experienced anything unusual myself. However, one volunteer who stayed for a few months had an experience that genuinely rattled her. One morning, she woke up visibly shaken and insisted she had seen figures standing near our beds during the night. She described one as tall and dark with what looked like a wide-brimmed hat, and another smaller shape beside it. According to her, the figures didn't move or speak. I'll admit my first reaction was skepticism, fatigue, unfamiliar sleeping environments, maybe her imagination. I even told her that if it happened again, she should wake me so that I could see for myself. But it never did, at least not while I was there. After all these years, I still don't consider myself a believer in the paranormal. Every one of these stories could have a rational explanation. I just don't know what it could be, but they remain one of the closest I've ever come to admitting. But they remain the closest that I'll ever come to events that I genuinely struggle to categorize neatly. I was at the fair with my wife and 6-year-old daughter. From the moment we arrived, I had the feeling that we shouldn't be there. I can't explain it beyond a feeling in the pit of my stomach that was telling me this wasn't the place for us. I told my wife, but she brushed it off because she loves the fair. The girls were having fun, and we had tickets for the monster truck show. Halfway through the monster truck, there was an intermission, and I took the moment to say, nope, we're leaving now. Not gonna argue about it, it's time to go. It was a 25-minute drive home, and by the time we arrived home, it was already on the news, the local paper's website, and all over Facebook, that there had been a gang-related shooting at the fairground in the concessions area we had to walk through on our way out. Huge police response. EMS, everything. It happened no less than a minute after we got into our car. Thankfully, we didn't hear the shots, and we never told our daughter. Needless to say, my wife trusts my gut now. And for those asking, the feeling started in the car and grew stronger as we approached the fair. I can say to the best of my memory, I never spoke up before we even entered the gates, and the feeling grew stronger over the course of the next 4 hours we were there. We went on rides, saw animals, ate all the food, but as the truck show started, it got to the point where I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. This obviously took place in the USA, and seeing the amount of places people have said this happens elsewhere makes me sad. I want to preface this by saying everything here is 110% true. In high school, a friend and I were at the lake late at night, watching a light storm in the distance. We were just chatting. We were kicked out of the recreational area we were in because it closed at 10. We were still watching the storm and hanging out, and we didn't really want to go back to town. I took her to another spot I frequented with other friends. We pulled up in my car, and as soon as I turned the key off, her boyfriend called her. Granted, he was an absolute POS, but he was only calling because he got a weird feeling and wanted to make sure that she was alright. I thought he was just trying to interrupt her hanging out with someone who wasn't him. So we get out of the car and walked over to the edge of the low cliff that overlooks the same lake/thunderstorm view we had just been watching, sat down and continued hanging out. At first I thought it was the wind in the distance. It hadn't been a particularly strong night, but the storm was moving closer, so who was I to question it? Then it started to get louder, bouncing off the cliffs around us and off the water below us that was quietly crashing against the sand. I remember we stopped talking and looked at each other, listening to what was becoming increasingly clear was sobbing. Not just normal crying, but a wailing, sobbing woman. We stopped talking after that, and simply attempted to listen. It was a big lake that was extremely popular. It could be anyone. It was still further off, and we figured someone was having a bad day, until it started getting louder and closer. With the way sound bounces, it was hard to tell from which direction it was coming from, but it certainly was getting closer. At this point, we fell totally silent, and I remember the feeling in the air around me was thick with tension. My friend and I were rigid next to each other, frozen to our seats, and it sounded like it kept getting closer. What had been debatedly wind or a bad day was raising the hairs on my arms, the back of my neck prickling, an overall body feeling that can only be understood by those who have experienced it. In the back of my mind, I was thinking about what my friends said that they had encountered out here, what their friends said they had encountered out here, and as it got closer, the sobbing became clear and more intense. And what started off as ordinary sobbing now started sounding like someone in the throes of grief. I can't tell you why we didn't get up and leave right then, other than we were rooted to our seats. A few more moments of her melancholy breakdown and finally it was too close. I could hear greenery rustling, and it sounded like this woman was next to the shore we were on. It was at that moment I unfroze. Instinctively, I get out of there, kicking in, and calmly ask my friend, "Hey, do you want to head back into town?" As soon as the words left my mouth, There was an instantaneous reaction, a wail like I've never heard. The instinctual terror I felt in that moment has yet to be matched by anything in my life. Thank God my car was less than 30 yards from us. We leapt up, sprinting back to the car, and I have always been trained not to run from predators. And as I did, I thought to myself, you're not supposed to run. It'll trigger the predator's drive. But there was no accounting for how visceral the fear was, the overall strangeness I felt that night. I unlocked the car as we were running. We threw ourselves in, and before the doors were even closed, I was speeding down the road at 50 miles an hour. To this day, we have no idea what it was and never went back to find out. I refused to be out there at night with fewer than 4 people. Even then, the woods still freak me out. In my early 20s, I got my first car. Myself and a friend went to a house party held by people that we knew well. The party had great vibes, and we were all having a good time. Out of nowhere, I was overcome with a feeling of absolute dread, like a sense of impending doom that was impossible to ignore. I told my friend that it was time to go. Now he looked me in the eyes and didn't hesitate and said, "Okay, let's go." We both got into our cars and drove away, and when we rounded the corner out of the street, we spotted about 15 cars all parked up on the side of the road. Turns out, a local gang who were notorious for crashing parties and literally kidnapping people and torturing them, bashing girls as they held down their boyfriends, all sorts of terrible stuff like that, had found out about the party and were waiting down the street to raid it. After we left, we heard the gang had crashed the party, bashed as many guys and girls as they could, kidnapped a few people, and even run over partygoers as they drove away. That was a powerful lesson to trust your gut. I'm unsure whether the events described are paranormal and not in nature, but seeing as I'd never had anything like this before or since, I'd like to think there's a good possibility. My father, who passed away in 2012, born the 21st of August 1968, was a very stoic man, not at all into the occult or paranormal, and did not ever speak of things like this, other than this one event. We're from Mobile, Alabama, where part of the Civil War took place, and the house my father grew up in, the land was used directly in the Battle of Mobile Bay. There are also sealed tunnels, and under a few houses in the historic district that are presumably old slave tunnels, including the house my father grew up in. My father never talked about ghosts, and was very anti-heebie-jeebies, was very quick to shut down these things if I mentioned something scared me. But he shared one story with me his entire life, maybe 2 to 3 times total before passing away, and would become overcome with emotions when talking about it. It's worth mentioning to make it more cohesive, the layout. When you open the front door, there are stairs immediately on the right-hand side, and on the left is a hallway that opens up into a living room, and on the end of that living room, my grandparents' bedroom at the time. On the hallway to the left were 2 archways with about 5 foot of wall in the line between them. That opened up into the family den, with my grandfather's study on the inside that had glass doors. Thank you for bearing with me to this point. The event is as follows. When my dad was around 11 years old, he was upstairs in his bedroom and woke up with a feeling of dread, and what he explained was pure despair and fear. So he got out of his bed and walked downstairs. About halfway down the stairs, he said he was having to force himself to keep walking because he was so afraid. When he made it to the bottom of the stairs, he could see into the first archway. The den itself was dark, but the study light was on. Inside the study, he said he saw a man, but more like a shadow completely devoid of anything. More like the absence of everything, entirely pitch black with zero definition other than the outline of a top hat on, standing in this study. He ran to the wall in between the archways with his back to the wall and said he could hear his heart beating in his ears and he was paralyzed with fear. After about a minute, he leaned over and looked into the den through the second archway and said that whatever this thing was turned its entire body towards him, and he took off running down the hallway. This was about a week after his older sister had played with a Ouija board in the home. I've looked this up since being told about it, and the Hat Man seems like a pretty common phenomena. But there's no way that my dad could have known this. He didn't have the internet like that as a kid, and didn't even know how to work an iPhone really when he was older. He was a brilliant man, just not very tech savvy. I don't know how he would have ever made this up. Has anyone had any similar experiences? When I was about 12, my mum, dad and myself moved into this house after my granddad passed away for a month or two, and then had to leave for a little over a month while some work got done in the house. When we moved back in, the house felt entirely different. We had tons of crazy stuff happen there that I'd be happy to share another time. This morning, we woke up to a commotion. Our whippets were going berserk inside the home, and I saw 2 dogs outside our home, looking agitated. After looking out the window, I saw they killed our cat next to the house, and me and my wife immediately went outside, cursed, chased them away, and were very upset. Something felt off inside me when I saw the dogs. Even before I saw that they had killed my cat, they looked evil with a dark aura. Well, fast forward an hour after trying to chase the dogs away and trying to find their owner, we take our cat to bury him. We wrap him up in a towel and load him in the car, and the dogs are nowhere to be seen. We drive about 3 miles away into the veld, what we call the wild area in South Africa, to a subtle spot in the middle of nowhere. I start digging the hole and my wife draws my attention to something. Right there in the middle of nowhere, the 2 dogs, the very same ones, are standing about 20 meters away looking at us as I'm digging the hole, and a shiver goes down my spine. I tell my wife this doesn't feel right. We chase them away and they disappear not to be seen again, but we chalk it up to nothing. Now this could have purely been coincidence, but those things felt evil from the get-go. In South Africa, we have what is called sangamas, which are basically witch doctors, and they are rumored to be able to put curses on people and practice dark rituals. And this honestly felt like that. Has anyone ever experienced things like this? Hellhounds, curses, I don't know. I just thought some of you might be able to shed some light on this. This was my scariest moment ever. I had been staying at my boyfriend's at the time, and needed to pop home to grab some more clothes. As soon as I got inside, I had this overwhelming feeling like the house didn't want me to be there. No one was home and it was dark and silent. I ran upstairs, grabbed whatever I could from the closet and got the hell out of there. I remember standing in the driveway looking up at the house with the most immense sense of dread I've ever had. 1 week later, we had my 21st at home. A few strange things happened, one of them being when my sister, cousin and I were doing our hair, I smelled what I thought was smoke. My cousin insisted it was just the straightener, so I let it go. Then my grandmother asked if I was cold, because it was winter, and my dress didn't have sleeves. Bear in mind we were inside, and if I should put the heater on. For some reason I decided not to, which was very unusual for me. I always have it on in the winter. While this was all happening, one of the downlights on the main room started flickering, which it had done periodically for a few weeks, but we never thought much of it. Later that night, when all the guests had gone to bed and we were in bed, I woke up to the smoke alarm absolutely blaring. I remember being in denial and trying to tell myself it was the house alarm. It sometimes went off by itself, so I tried to key in the code but nothing happened. Then, accepting that it was in fact the smoke alarm, I went downstairs thinking, where is this fire? There's no fire here. Sure enough, when I got down and went to the main room, I looked up at the duct heating vent and saw bright orange flames just frolicking around. It was unreachable. It spread between the two floors and melted a water pipe, making water fall out of the ceiling, which made no sense to me at the time, and I just could not process the danger I was in. We all got outside, including our 2 dogs and some guests that had stayed. We saw the whole house burnt down. There was an explosion when it reached the gas, and I have never felt such intense, acute terror since. Later, when the engineer inspected it, he said it started from a faulty downlight and had been smoldering for at least a few days. That explained the smell when we were doing our hair. It explained the flickering light, and if I had turned on the heater that night, it would have ignited with all our guests inside, and who knows what would have happened if I did. So my house burnt down on the 21st, and we lost everything. When I was a kid, I grew up back and forth between England and Ireland due to having families in both countries. No matter which country I was living in at the time, one thing that has never changed was being taken on some family trip to see a castle. In fact, I've been to so many castles during my childhood I can't even count them all. Most of the castles I saw in England were with my grandparents, but by the time I was once again living in Ireland, these castle trips with them had been substituted for castle hunting with my dad, as he liked to call it. I didn't really like these castle hunting trips with my dad, mostly because the castles we went to were very small and unimpressive compared to the grand and well-preserved ones I saw in England. In fact, the castles we went to in Ireland weren't even castles, but more like fortified houses. From the 16th century, there are some terrific castles in Ireland, but the only problem with Irish castles is this: they're either privately owned or completely swarmed with tourists, so my dad preferred to find the lesser-known ones in the country. Searching the web for one of these lesser-known castles, my dad would then find that one was near the border between the provinces of Leinster and Munster, although I can't remember which county or even province this castle was in. After an hour of driving to find the castle, we came upon a small cow field in the middle of nowhere. The reason we stopped outside this field was because the castle we were looking for just happened to be inside it. Unlike the other castles we'd already seen, this one was definitely not a fortified house. The ruins were fairly tall, with 2 out of the 4 remaining round towers. Clearly, no effort had been made to preserve this castle, as it was entirely covered in vegetation. But for a castle in Ireland, it was very much worth the trip. Entering the field to explore the castle, one of the first things I see is an entrance to a very dark room, or perhaps chamber. Although I was curious as to what was inside there, the entrance was extremely dark, so dark all I could see was black. I've always been afraid of going into very dark places, but for some reason, despite how terrified the thought of entering this room was, I also felt a strong, unfamiliar urge to go through the dark, as though something was trying to lure me in there. As curious as I was to enter this pitch-black entrance, I was also just as afraid. It was as though my determined curiosity and fear of the dark were equal to each other in this moment, where in the past my fear of the darkness was always much stronger. Torn between my curiosity to enter the darkness and my fear of it, I eventually moved on to explore the rest of the castle ruins, where I would, once again, come upon another entrance. Unlike the first entrance, this one was not as dark, therefore I could see this entrance was in fact a tunnel of sorts, and just like the first, I again felt a strong urge to go inside, swallowing my fear, which was a rare occurrence for me. I worked up the courage to enter the tunnel without my phone or flashlight in hand, before reaching where the light ended and the darkness began. With the darkness of the tunnel right in front of me, I again felt an incredibly strong urge, where again, it felt as though something was indeed trying to lure me in. But as strong as this lure and my own curiosity was, thankfully, my fear of dark places won out, and so I exit the tunnel and go find my dad on the other side. Telling my dad about this tunnel I found, he then enters with his flashlight to look around. Although I was safely outside, I could see my dad waving his flashlight through the darkness rather than exploring further down the tunnel, which I expected him to do. When my dad comes out and back to me, I asked him why he didn't explore further down. He said, right where the darkness of the tunnel begins, there is a deep hole with jagged rocks and bricks at the bottom. This revelation was quite jarring to me, because when I entered the tunnel a few minutes ago, I was not only incredibly close to where the hole was, but I also almost let this lure bring me into the dark, where I most certainly would have fallen into that hole. After exploring the castle ruins for a few more minutes, we then headed back into the car to drive home. While driving back, I asked my dad if he explored the first entrance that I nearly went into. I should mention my dad is ex-military, and I've never really known him to be scared of anything. But when I asked him if he explored that dark room, to my surprise, he said he was too afraid to go in there even with a flashlight. This is the same man who free climbs our roof just to paint the chimney. Like I've already said, I've explored many castles in the UK and Ireland, and despite many of them having dark, eerie rooms, this particular castle seemed to draw me in and petrify me in a way no castle has ever done before. It definitely felt as though something was trying to lure me into those dark entrances, and if that was the case, then was it intentionally trying to make me fall down the hole? That's a question I've asked myself many times, but who knows? Maybe it was absolutely nothing. I tried to track down the name of the location for this particular castle, searching different websites for the lesser-known castles in Ireland. The castle I found didn't match the one in appearance, and I even tried to use ChatGPT to find it, but none of the castles it suggested matched either. I did recently ask my dad about the name of the location of the castle, but because it was some years ago, unfortunately he couldn't recall. So what do you think? Did something really try to lure me into those ruins? And if so, was its intention to make me fall down the jagged hole? For context, I work in a very old bank, and it is the last bank left in town. I think the building was originally built so that it could be lived in as a home in case the property didn't sell, but I didn't think anyone ever actually lived in it. This is why I'm on the fence about what we heard. To start, me and my manager were getting ready for the day. It's a small branch, so only 2 to 3 people are working at the time, and we were silently working on our computer behind the teller, when I heard blatant footsteps in the lobby. The first thing I did was look over at my manager to see if she was standing there, and she looked at me as well. She asked me if I'd heard the same thing, and I said yes, those were definitely footsteps. Since we work in the bank, our first train of thought was that someone may have snuck inside. Obviously, we were a little scared. My manager walked through the first floor and verified no one was there. We also have an upstairs, which is locked and used for holiday decoration storage, so she checked upstairs and found nothing. She told me she was going to call our security guard after we left. I joked that it was a ghost, and we both agreed it was super creepy and moved on with our day and left. Then, she sends me a message like an hour later telling me that the person who had come in to clean a few days ago had also heard footsteps and voices. He had reported it to our security guy as well, which was how she found out. After what had happened with the cleaning guy, a different manager had gone to the branch 2 days ago after work to check it out, and he swears that he shut the light off upstairs, only for it to be turned back on by itself. Obviously, this second happening could have just been an honest mistake. I think I do things all the time when I didn't actually, not like turning a light off. The first thing I did was ask my manager if the building had an attic. I've heard too many horror stories of people discovering that someone has been living in their attic after hearing random footsteps and voices. But nope, no attic, just a crawl space to get to the HVAC. Anyway, I'm super creeped out right now, and I'm convinced my work is haunted. I think I'm going to go upstairs next shift and pull a Zach Brannigan. If you're here, show me a sign, and hopefully someone doesn't throw a Christmas tree at me. I've been staying at my boyfriend's house since June. I work from home, and he leaves for work at 8 every morning. So yesterday he left for work and called me on the way until he got there at 8:30. Every morning I go out with the dogs and feed them. Around 4:30, I go outside and let them run out and walk back in because I forgot my water. As I'm walking back to the door, I'm just humming along, singing, and I leave the door open. I walk over to the door, and out of my peripheral, I see this bright green object taking the form of a box, floating 4 to 5 feet off the ground. It's by one of the sheds, and it must have heard my voice because it immediately darted back behind the side of the shed. In the backyard, there's a pool 40 feet from the back of the house, and behind the pool is the shed that's about 30 feet back, so there's some distance. Immediately, I freaked out and called my boyfriend, still outside, and I'm trying to convince myself my eyes were messing with me. So he told me to go back inside and calm down. And so I took the dogs and went inside and waited to see if this thing would poke back out after it thought I had left. So I'm looking through the glass door, and to my horror it did. I was so scared. What could this be? I called my boyfriend again, and he told me to lock up and get out of there, and as he's talking, this thing starts creeping out completely, and I see it. This long, rectangular, bright green object about the length of the car, floating out from the side of the shed. I'm watching it come out into the clearing and then disappear behind the shed. Unfortunately, I was too stunned or scared to take any pictures or videos, and his camera, that pointed to where it was happening, was all down, and we weren't able to retrieve any footage. Does anyone have the remotest idea on what the hell this could have been? I work in a very old building that had stables at one point. It has gone through other changes over the last 60 years or so. I was working late one evening and was the only woman in the building. No clients were in, and I was cramming to hit a deadline. I go into the 2-stall bathroom. It's very small, so small that you can't have the door open while the first stall door is open. Anyway, I'm there doing my business. The stall next to me opens and shuts. The stall next to the bathroom entrance. But I didn't hear the main door open. I thought that was weird. I looked down to see if I recognized the shoes. The shoes are women's horse riding boots, brown lace-ups, and I'm like, who is that? I don't say anything, but I finish up quickly, and as I'm leaving the stall, I then go to catch a peek through the open area of the stall where the door closes. But no one's there. Then I see that it's not even locked and push it. Nobody was there. I freaked out and ran. I have a handful of stories about that place. Nearly everyone who has been there for a while has experienced the different ghosts. We have only one full-body apparition. She was an employee and friends with a lot of us through the years, and died suddenly in 2011. She still comes back at night, and the cleaning lady has spoken with her before she knew she was a ghost, and said the woman was a bit rude and snapped at her. There was also what we call the black mass of energy that floats between one end of the hall to the other. This has been seen by a few people, so many others. I love that we have ghosts. The only bummer is that they have been quiet since the construction and renovation to modernize the building started to happen, and I hope when they conclude, the ghosts are still around for company. When my husband and I were teenagers and first started dating, we were parked in an empty golf course for some privacy. We had been to this spot before, and it was a great place to walk around at night and then make out in the car. Tonight was different. As soon as we pulled in, something felt wrong. I reclined my chair back to hide myself, paranoid that someone was watching us. We sat for a few moments, making awkward small talk. I was suddenly filled with overwhelming dread and sheepishly asked if we could leave. My then boyfriend immediately obliged, a little too quickly considering the hormones of the teenage boys and the plans we had to fool around. He peeled out the parking lot, my seat still fully reclined because at this point I'm absolutely convinced we aren't alone. The bottom of the Honda scrapes the ditch of the driveway as we pull out in a panic. At this point, neither of us had communicated with one another what we were feeling, but his reaction was enough to know we were on the same page. We were in danger. We sped a few miles away before we broke the silence, and I put my seat back into its upright position. I tried to laugh it off, and admitted I wasn't sure why I was scared. Neither of us really had an explanation for the sudden fear we both experienced, but decided not to question it too much. We found out after the fact there was a brutal attack on a few teens walking home from the burger joint by the golf course, by a schizophrenic homeless man. I'm convinced we both felt like someone was watching us because he was, and I know if we had gone on our normal late-night walk, something horrible would have happened. This happened almost 16 years ago, and I can still see it vividly. I was walking on what's normally considered a busy street at 2 a.m. with a few friends, in front of the Augustana National, for anyone familiar with this city, while it was seemingly empty. Then, I got this really weird feeling of we should cross the street, which was really odd because no one was around, but my friends didn't argue because we would have had to have done it later anyway. Well, not 10 seconds later, a drunk driver comes speeding and barreling through exactly where we were, crashed through the fence line, and impacted into a tree. As I said, if we had not crossed the road, if that funny feeling hadn't told me to move when we did, it's very likely that some of us would have ended up dead. When my daughter was a few months old, I left her on the bed surrounded by pillows while I washed her clothes in the bathroom outside our room. I didn't have to leave her for long. That's why I decided to use the bathroom instead of the laundry room downstairs. I checked on her every few minutes just to make sure she was still asleep. On the third time I tried checking on her, I found her on the floor crying softly. I freaked out, of course, and looked over her for injuries and found none. But the thing that really scared me was that almost half her body was inside the gap of roughly 4 inches between the bed and the floor, and it seemed like she was just stuck because of her diaper. She was so young she wasn't even able to crawl back then, so there was no way it was her doing it, but I don't want to entertain any other explanation because most of the time there was only the two of us at home and it was a big house. Then 2 years after, the horrors started involving her, which is a story for another time. So she could see ghosts for a while, which is no longer an issue now, as we brought her to someone who performed a ritual to remove the ability to see, because one of her grandmas was afraid those entities might do something bad to her, like take her away. When she was around 6 or 7, she asked me one time if ghosts are real, and I got on the defensive and demanded if her classmates were messing with her by scaring her with ghost stories. And she said no. And so I tried to explain that there are no ghosts. I thought she was just curious, and after a few weeks she started to ask the same question again, so I grilled her. Why was she asking the same thing again? I already answered her and asked her what the real problem was. Then she started sobbing and said that she can see them everywhere. You have no idea how scared I was right at that moment, seeing how upset she was over this. And I do believe her because she never once lied, and because of the next thing that came out of her mouth. I asked her for details, and she said they looked scary, but not because they are bloody or gory, but because their faces are all muddled up. Sometimes she would see them beside us, saying they never did anything aside from always look at her. One time she was watching TV in her uncle's room. She left in a hurry, and when I questioned her as to why, she said they were blocking the TV. But the scariest was the hairy dark man that she sometimes sees walking up the stairs. Reliving her stories always gives me goosebumps. When I was a baby of roughly 2 years old, I had a near-death experience which I believe gave me the ability to see and communicate with spirits. This story takes place when I was 8. I stayed in my grandparents' house with my grandparents, my mother and her 2 siblings, my aunt's 3 children, and my abusive stepfather and great-grandmother. I stayed in a room with my 2 cousins. The room was connected to the hallway with no doors. I was in my bed, with one of our cats lying on my stomach, when suddenly the cat jumped off the bed and ran into my grandparents' room directly up one of the hallways, and I was dragged out of bed by my hair by something I couldn't see. It then put me up against the wall and choked me until I started crying. Everything then stopped when my great-grandmother's door opened and I heard her going into the bathroom. I immediately started crying and screaming. Everyone woke up and came to see what was wrong, and I told them what happened, and my great-grandmother came out of the bathroom and saw that I had handprints on my neck. Nobody could explain anything. My mother called the police and then took me to the hospital the next day and found more handprints on my back and stomach where the cat was. My great-grandmother decided to tell the family the truth about the dark spirits in the house, and that she had the ability as well, and that this was our family curse. My great-grandma, who passed away before I was born, told my mother and father that I would have blue eyes and brown hair. Actively, I'm still the only member of my family who has blue eyes and brown hair. My mother, father, Nana, and other family members passed this story on to me over the years, which was a shock for them all, of how she would have known that before passing on. Moving forward to our first home when I was a baby, my mother described a story to me just the same as she tells her friends and other family. She remembers her and my father waking up to the sound of me as a baby, as if I were being strangled. Over the years of being in that apartment as we were growing up, me and my brother always heard noises. Before I got any truth about this maybe attachment, we would hear cutlery in the kitchen clinking in the middle of the night, and other times my mother and father would find cabinets open, which should not be, considering they were always the first 2 people to wake up in the morning. Our neighbors would also tell us when all of us were not home, they could hear loud noises through the roof there, which would make no sense as nobody was home. One time we stayed in the apartment downstairs because my family were attending my uncle's funeral and staying at my aunt's home from my father's side because I was too young to attend a funeral, and my best friend lived downstairs and her mother had me stay with her that night. We all sat in her living room and had dinner before getting ready to go to bed. And all 3 of us, me, my best friend and her mother, could really hear loud noises coming from our apartment upstairs. They were very loud. Her mother went upstairs to check and no one was there. She told my parents the next day the same thing about it, and for the first time she heard the loud noise while it should be silent, and it confirmed what my neighbors were hearing. Between me and my brother, I'm the youngest, from 3 boys and 1 girl. Back then, they were also told there was a female spirit attached to me. In 2011, we moved into a bigger apartment because our first one was small and we definitely needed more space. I was now 11 years old. For the first few months, we did not hear much, but then things would start happening again. Out-of-pocket sounds, and our stairs still to this day, in 2025, is a place for noise and complete silence. My mother and brother confirmed it sounded like heavy metal boots stumping up and down those stairs. Growing up through my teenage years, we still get all of these noises, doors opening, and we even heard our oven door slam shut when it was only me, my brother and father in the living room. It spooked my brother so bad, he asked me and my mum to check the kitchen. At the age of 20, I went to see a medium and tried to get some advice on this stuff, and to me it will always be a shock and never a coincidence. She said the exact same thing my family was told many years ago, about there being a female spirit attached to me. My now fiancé, who never knew any of this beforehand after moving in with me, confirmed similarities, and after that me and my family told him the stuff that happened over the years, and it was actually nice to have the extra confirmation from someone who did not experience this stuff and never knew about it from the start. I'm 26 now, and we still experience strange things happening, and we are starting to consider saging the house and using other methods to get whatever this is to move on, because it's been around for far too long and left me unsettled. I still wear a cross around my neck and still have a video file that was given to me by my mother of our cats trying to chase something and grab it when there's nothing there. I do not expect anyone to believe me, but wanted to put the story out there and add as much detail as I could collect. It gets hard to believe when you've not experienced it yourself, and I completely understand because I used to be oblivious to it all until I got older, and it's still happening. My wife and I are pretty staunch skeptics when it comes to the supernatural, but this moment which happened yesterday has us questioning things. She went on a work trip and was staying at the Star Casino in Gold Coast, Australia. She had a room to herself and was getting dressed to go to a function. She had a necklace which she purchased recently and it was brand new. It was not an heirloom, nor was it pre-owned, and it was in a triangle. She spent a minute trying to undo the knots with a pin. There were 2 small knots and 1 large one, and she got very frustrated and eventually gave up because she was running late. She left it in the bed and went into the bathroom momentarily. When she returned to the bed, the necklace was laid out on the bed, completely stretched out in a long straight line, all the knots gone. She froze on the spot, knowing moments ago it was in a knotted pile. She immediately thought someone must be in the room or the balcony, and she checked everywhere expecting the worst. The room was empty and secure. The AI security technology in the hotel is very cutting edge. People can't even stop at your floor without card access. Why would a criminal mastermind unknot the necklace and leave it stealthily? How could they do it so quickly as well? This hotel was built in 1985, and we found no stories of the supernatural there. She put the necklace on and went to the function, and my wife is the most logical and intelligent person you'll ever meet, so she can usually explain anything away. But she's stumped with this experience, and honestly, so am I. When I was around 8, I had a monster that lived in my door. It took the shape of a family. I thought they were imaginary friends, a little boy, a little girl, and their grandfather. They didn't come from under the bed or the closet, but they lived inside my bedroom door, as in the door itself. So I'd talk to them, laugh with them and play simple games. They'd press their faces through the wood grain and told me that if I crawled into the door, they could play other games with me. They told me they had a huge world on the other side. All I had to do was go through. I didn't understand what they meant. Well, one evening my mum overheard me talking to them and asked who I was speaking to. I told her the truth and pointed at the door. She stared for a long moment and said, "I don't see anyone, sweetheart." But something in her voice definitely sounded nervous. She let me sleep in her room that night and took my bed like she always did when I had nightmares. In the morning, my mum was shaky. She told me to help her move all my things into her room. She changed the lock on my old bedroom door and locked it from the outside, and told me I was never allowed in again, ever. We moved out of that house a few months later, and she never explained why until a few years after. She said she woke up because she heard voices coming from the hallway, the voices of children. At first, she thought it was me, until she realized I was asleep next to her. When she looked towards my bedroom door across the hall, she saw the same children and the same old man I had described, only they weren't smiling this time, but were furious. She said they melted into each other like wax in reverse until they formed a single mass, and the creature that looked like dripping plastic with tentacles and many eyes. And while staring at it, she couldn't move. She locked the door, and the moment the sun came up, refused to let me anywhere near that room. As an adult, I finally looked into the history of the house. The previous owner had been involved in some occult ritual. Police reports said he'd killed himself in the room that later became my bedroom. I still think about what would have happened if I'd figured out how to crawl into that door. Something strange happened during my recent visit to the Orsay Museum in Paris on Saturday. I was there with my family, and like most tourists, I had my phone out and was taking pictures of interesting things which caught my eye. One of the museum's most iconic sights is a huge clock, a remnant of its past when it was a train station, Gare d'Orsay, built between 1898 and the 1900. The museum showcases primarily French art from 1848 to 1914. I arrived at the clock around 9:12 p.m, and there was a decent crowd taking pictures. After a while, I found a moment when no one was blocking the view, so I snapped a clean shot of the clock face. Right after, I checked the photo on my phone, which I usually do to make sure no one photobombs and that the lighting is good. I saw in the bottom left of the corner what appeared to be a ghostly figure. It looked like a girl with long hair seated on the floor with her arms resting on her knees wearing a flowing dress. There was a large puddle or smear of blood on the floor in front of her, almost leading to where she was seated. Of course, when I looked back to where she would have been in real life, there was nothing there. To see if it is the phone or something else in the air creating the effect, I immediately took another picture. In the second image there was nothing, just the empty space next to the clock. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. I inspected the spot where the figure was in the picture to check for any strange reflection or flaw imperfections that might create an illusion, but nothing I could find seemed to explain it. There was nothing eerie or fearful about the experience, as there were quite a few people around. I thought I would try to see if anyone else had ever reported something similar, or if there were ghost stories linked to the Orsay Museum. And after some quick research, I couldn't find much about any hauntings there. Was this just an optical illusion? Recent phones with some AI photo optimization features could have created the ghostly image by accident. If so, why did it appear so detailed? And why did it show up only on one shot? I don't know what the explanation is. Perhaps one of you might. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed episode 5 of Paranormal Week. It has definitely been a blast, and hopefully I'll see you tomorrow as we wrap up with demons. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to leave some love down in the below, maybe hype the video, and if you would like even more content, you can follow me over on Patreon to get some of that too. You get some exclusive perks and content. And you get your name at the end like these guys, so that's cool if you want. But that's it from me. See you tomorrow, guys. Good night.